right. Welcome back, everybody. Hope you had a good break. I'm glad we're getting on now with the afternoon portion of our agenda. This is a panel that's focused on improving digital identity, looking at where government can help. And what are we going to talk about? Well, as much as we talk about identity and different solutions, government's the only authoritative issuer of identity. But the systems are largely limited to paper and plastic credentials, where commerce is increasingly digital. I think we heard a lot this morning about how that gap between the two is causing some real challenges. So improving digital identity is going to require the government, given its role in identity, to help close this gap. And this panel is going to explore what agencies are doing today and where Congress also might look to steer things next. We got a great panel today with leaders from both government agencies as well as Capitol Hill. So Jason Lim is the branch manager for screening technology integration programs at the TSA, and their lead on, among other things, mobile driver's license applications. Phil Lamb, an old colleague of mine from government, is executive director for identity at the U.S. General Services Administration. Tim Whaler is the economic policy advisor and legislative counsel for Congressman Bill Foster. And Katie Weschler is the executive director of the Consumer First Coalition, a group that the Better Identity Coalition has been working with pretty closely as the Social Security Administration stands up a new identity attribute validation service. So welcome, everybody. Let's dive right into things. We heard this morning how bad identity theft and identity fraud got during the pandemic, a message that was only buttressed by the picture that our partners at the ID Theft Resource Center painted as they described the results of their annual data breach report. And so much of what we're seeing is tied to how easy it is for criminals and other adversaries to exploit stolen identity data because of the ways that we verify identity in the physical world don't translate to the digital world. But government's largely just been producing systems that to date have been made for physical. One of the discussions during Susan Gibson's keynote this morning about ways to close that gap between physical and digital was, are there ways we can come up with solutions where an agency can be asked by an American to vouch for them if they already know something about that person or issue them a credential in the online world? Phil, I know you've been looking to make some changes on this from your post at GSA. What's going on over there these days? What can you tell us about what some of the programs are that are in the works?
Sure. So first off, thank you, Jeremy, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to speak to you all and speak with the larger community about what we're doing here in identity. So what is GSA doing around identity? We've been focusing on identity for several years now. One of the things that we like to do is talk with our agency partners about what are their needs from a security perspective, as well as from a usability perspective. Understand what they are so that we can provide them with shared services. And because what we want to avoid is we want to avoid agencies having to sort of roll their own capabilities, which we've seen done and struggle over the past decade. And one of the biggest shared services that we have as GSA is login.gov. And as some of you may know, login.gov was provided some strong central funding so that we can really help address this challenge head on and help our agencies to handle identity verification. So login.gov was provided about $187 million from the Technology Modernization Fund because we see it as the one account for government. The one account that you would need as a taxpayer, as a beneficiary, a veteran, so that you can interface in a secure and equitable way. So that is one of the larger efforts we're doing here at GSA and sort of scaling that capability to all our federal agencies. But the other is what you alluded to before, Jeremy, about authoritative data sources. So something that GSA has taken a particular interest in is helping sort of advance that concept that SSA is doing around strong authoritative attribute verification. And how can we do that with other agencies, such as the post office, for example, with address, or State Department, perhaps, with the passport, and maybe even TSA with the known traveler number. And how do we bring together these different government agencies so that we can do identity verification at the attribute level, direct to the authoritative source?
Thanks, Phil. And Jason, if I can throw things over to you, some of the more exciting work in the space has been led by TSA in the States with mobile driver's license solutions. What can you tell us about the state of things there today?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Jeremy. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. As you mentioned, the transition from a physical ID to digital ID, that's what's really we're trying to struggle with and be able to assist the industry as they move to the digital form of ID. So as you know, we encounter over 2 million IDs a day, right? Most of them are physical IDs, but people are starting to provision their digital wallets with IDs. So how do we make sure that we can ingest those IDs in a secure way that we can authenticate so that the integrity of the data coming over enjoys a full forward privacy, as well as the ability to ensure that they are the correct data. So we've been working with Apple. I think that's the public one. We've been working with other vendors as well in order to build an ecosystem based on open standard by which we can ingest this data. And we have plans to launch a pilot with iOS devices, then follow up with Android devices by the end of this fiscal year across multiple locations.
Thanks. And is that going to focus just on in-person use cases, or is this something that could be used for remote identity proofing as well? Say with some of the benefits applications we were hearing about from our last panel that have been a challenge during the pandemic.
So the way we actually see the identity management space is threefold. One is the ID enrollment and proofing. Then we have the identity vetting. Then we have identity verification, which is what happens at the checkpoints. So right now we're focusing on ID verification at the checkpoint for in-person use case. Having said that, the ecosystem we're working on and we're participating with other stakeholders in this space will inform how that ID verification can also happen online.
All right, thanks. Kate, I want to throw over to you with the Consumers First Coalition. You've been a partner with Better Identity Coalition and working with SSA. Talk a little bit about what SSA has been building and how it's been impacting some of your members.
Yeah, Jeremy, happy to, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. As you mentioned, your coalition and mine have been working for the last about 4 years now, working with SSA on the building and the launch of their electronic consent-based social security verification system, easier to say ECBSV. So ECBSV is a way for financial institutions with the consumer's consent to get a real-time verification that a name, date of birth, and social security number are a match according to SSA's records. The driver is to significantly reduce cases of synthetic identity fraud, where a victim of this type of fraud is most often children or others with little to no credit history, whose social security number is used by a criminal to establish a synthetic credit history. And then over time, these fake credit files are used to actually apply for and obtain credit. And it's not caught because you're not really checking your kid's credit report for quite some time. So the criminal is long gone by the time this is caught. It's not that financial institutions couldn't do this verification prior to this system being built. It was just that it was paper-based and very slow, to the point that, quite frankly, it wasn't useful, especially in our increasingly digital environment for credit applications and decisions. So, by the time you got the result from SSA that it wasn't a match, the criminal has gotten their credit and they're gone. So in 2018, legislation was enacted that directed SSA to build this real-time system. And Congress did provide some clear directions to SSA. And they specified the types of institutions that could access the system, that it mainly be financial institutions or their service providers, such as credit reporting agencies, and the reasons that you could be able to access the system, tying it to Fair Credit Reporting Act permissible purposes. And the legislation also required, I think very importantly, that entities that are using the system have to certify compliance with privacy and data security requirements under Gramm-Leach-Bliley. And it also allowed SSA to audit and monitor the entities using the system for that compliance. So since 2018, Jeremy and I have been working, partnering with SSA to make sure this system meets the congressional intent, meets the needs of the financial industry, that it's effective and efficient and secure. We've been working through so many different aspects of the system, technology requirements, how you obtain the consumer's consent, what that looks like, the relationship of service providers and the financial institutions, and data security and storage and access. And SSA, of course, needed to make sure that those that are accessing their system are meeting the highest of standards to maintain trust and security. So they also developed a user agreement to help ensure these standards are met, and there's accountability for the users. The great news is the system is now up and running. They've had nearly 40 million total transactions to date. And there's about a dozen entities that are using it directly. And there's many, many more that are registered indirectly, meaning they're using it through a service provider, like one of the credit reporting agencies. And our work continues, right, Jeremy? Like, this is not totally done. We're continuing to work to make it sure that it's efficient and effective as possible. But I think that the bottom line is, I really do think the system could be a model for other government, private sector verification initiatives. Real-time access to reliable and secure government data is key to combating identity theft and fraud. And so that's really what we're thinking about moving forward.
Thanks. So let me throw this over to Tim now. So I think a common theme we're seeing in government, we just heard 3 different examples of it, is there's a number of different digital or digital-ish, I guess I would call them, identity initiatives underway. What GSA is doing for government services, what TSA is doing with the focus right now on digital options at the checkpoint, ECBSV, which is focused on helping financial services firms root out synthetic identity fraud. There isn't any overarching strategy right now in the government in terms of what government should be doing or how to coordinate these different things. And your boss, Congressman Bill Foster, has been pretty outspoken on the need for government to take a more strategic approach. So tell us a little bit more about where he's been working and you on this front.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us, Jeremy. He's very excited about this space. Chances are, if you've spoken with him in the past 2 years, he's brought it up in some form or the other. And for good reason. It's a bipartisan issue. It's going to save taxpayer dollars, consumer dollars, aside from just being wildly convenient. So to that end, he's got a great bill, bipartisan bill, the Improving Digital Identity Act, which, amongst other things, would mainly create a task force on digital identity comprised of a few different federal agencies, the Treasury, Homeland Security, Department, Secretary of State, as well as some state and local members. So the goal there being that, we're going to have to talk with all these people to figure out what's the best implementation, and within, the hope being that they can eventually provide us some technical guidance on how to best implement a digital ID framework, what roadblocks there are, what statutory changes need to be made, and how to best go about it.
Great. Thanks, Tim. Well, talking about from a strategy perspective, there's, I think we talked about this in the prep call. Barack Obama, back when he was president, once noted the Interior Department's in charge of salmon when they're in freshwater, but then when they go over to saltwater, the Commerce Department's in charge of them. And, one of the concerns I think we're seeing these days with new services is that we could be heading to a somewhat similarly convoluted regulatory structure with identity validation services. For example, ECBSV's only available to banks today, but login.gov can't use it, nor can the commercial services that agencies are using to validate identity for, government benefits. Meanwhile, some of the other ID validation services GSA is starting to focus on right now with its ID verification efforts are focused just on government, but not by industry. So sort of a broader question to the panel for whoever wants to jump in, although, hopefully we can have a lively discussion on it. As these different services roll out, how do we ensure that there is a consistent and logical approach to how systems are architected, how they work, and then perhaps funded, as well as who can use them?
I'll start, if I may.
Please.
So first, I think it's worth noting that we're starting, though. I mean, that in itself is a big step. The work that SSA has done with ECBSV, I think I got that right, is really, honestly, it's groundbreaking for government agencies to allow that. They do it in a privacy preserving way where they're not sending information out. They're just saying yes or no. And that sort of model, as Kate was saying before, I think is a really great model for other agencies. So, Jeremy, when you think about additional, agencies coming on board, additional data sources coming on board, if we can look at SSA's model, I think that's how we can, at least from a technology and privacy and a citizen consent perspective, be aligned, right? Now, from the, this is only being used here, this is being only used there, obviously, I'm challenged by it as well. But I think this is how government works. This is how government innovates. It's one measured step at a time. And I think that could be a good thing. We could accelerate it, of course. But yes, things that GSA does support our federal agency partners first. That's what we do. And as there's more value, as there's more need, and as the administrator sees fit to it, it expands out beyond that. And I think that could be a good model as well as we think about enterprise shared services with identity too. Let's make sure this thing works, that the citizens like it, that it does protect and preserve people's privacy while providing those benefits around identity theft prevention, and then branch out from there.
Thanks. Who else wants to jump in on that?
Yeah, Jeremy, I'll just add that, something that we're doing when we're starting to talk to other agencies about where this can be useful. So we're really encouraging the agencies to talk to SSA about how it worked from the agency's perspective. I mean, I have the perspective of how I from the private sector of how successful we really think this has been, but we're really trying to encourage those agency communications. Like we've been talking to the Defense Department recently about their, how you can check active service member status. And that's a similar yes, no, there's some dates. So it's a little bit more detailed. So, we got to think through privacy issues a little bit more there, but there's so many common core elements of it. And it is a system that needs improvement. And we think that's another area that's ripe. So we're trying to get DOD to talk to SSA about how they've done it and really try to replicate.
Thanks. Tim or Jason, perspectives on how do we get a consistent approach across government?
Yes, from TSA perspective, besides the verification that happens at the checkpoint, right, using an MDL or DI, what we're developing right now is a risk framework by which self-enrollment of digital identity happens on your mobile device, right? Because we're working with private industry, private players who wants to issue their own digital identity that TSA can take. So we have to define what that means. How do we trust that digital identity if it's somebody, you, Jeremy, taking your own phone and interacting somehow with a back end of somebody who built, in order to assure that that person, that Jeremy, is that Jeremy that we can trust at the checkpoint using that digital identity. So we have a series of steps that we laid out with fairly prescriptive steps that we're trying to finalize in the next few months. That's going to create a baseline framework for digital identity trust that TSA can take. Having said that, part of that is going back to the source to validate that identity, right? Whether that's Passport, whether that's AMBA's DLDV service, or whether that's something like what SSA does, or as somebody mentioned in this comment, maybe that's where we take advantage of DHS or TSA's holding of trusted identities to do that ID validation. So to echo what Phil said, it is happening. And the fact that we are having this kind of discussion, thanks to you, is a great first step to, making sure all this come together at some point down the line.
All right, thanks. And Tim.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna kind of echo the sentiments that, there's a lot of, I think everybody has a pretty, lay understanding about, the companies that are out there that already kind of, in some way authenticate you to a phone or laptop or that sort of thing. So leveraging those technologies and, fostering the partnerships with the people who have already kind of started the blaze down that path, I think would be tremendously helpful.
Thanks. I want to dig into privacy and security for a little bit. I think it's hard to get too far into a discussion around the government doing something to solve digital identity without that instantly triggering a whole wave of concerns around, wait, isn't this going to get hacked, or is it going to make me vulnerable, or what's the government going to know about me, or who's going to track me? All of which are really important questions. And, I think, one thing we've consistently tried to talk about in the coalition has been, let's flag those issues up front and figure out, how to architect them up front so that there's a high bar set for security and privacy here. So how do each of you think we can do that, on a consistent basis across government?
So if I may go first, Jeremy, with our implementation, right, which is fairly mature as a pilot, So basically what we're trying to do in terms of ensuring interoperability that really is built with privacy and security in mind, we're leveraging an ISO standard that was just finalized last year. So it's ISO 18013-5 that has full forward privacy as well as multiple layers of cryptography in order to ensure what you just said, right? This security as well as privacy. Additionally, we are also purposely choosing an offline use case. What that means is that no issuing authority can track your passage through a TSA checkpoint by having us ping real time to get, to whether to assert, to validate your identity from some source. So we're using a mode based on the standard that, is the interactions is totally local and is secure. Also, we will delete your photo, both the live photo and the digital photo that comes across immediately upon match. And we have very short record retention for the other biographical PII data that's in line with the PIA that we have published. So if anybody is curious, that we just published a privacy impact assessment on the upcoming DI pilots we're about to embark, and that should be available to the public on the DHS website.
Excellent.
Yeah, I would just add that, just generally something, this idea gives you a lot more autonomy over your data, and also in determining who gets to see what parts of it. When you scan your driver's license, while your doctor's office may need to know your age, sex, date of birth, that sort of thing, maybe they don't need to know whether you're an organ donor or, I guess they do need to know your address sometimes. But to that end, you get to decide which parts of your identity are revealed, and it gives we can adopt a permissions-based system to give you better control over what aspects of your identity you want to reveal to which parties.
Thanks. And I wonder, Katie or Phil, if you could talk about the difference between an attribute validation service and a system that actually shares your personal data, and how, the impacts of each of those on, privacy and security. I think it's to you, Phil.
Sure. So I think historically, when data providers share and validate data, they actually provide you, the relying party, with the data slug. And they say, yep, Phil Lamb, this address, date of birth, social, all the things. They'll just give you that whole package. And what we're doing, and what Katie was describing before, is instead, we go and say, hey, Social Security, we'll send them Phil Lamb, Social Security number and date of birth, but Social Security will just respond back with a yes, no. So from a data security and a privacy standpoint, the data keeps and resides at the authoritative source, and only at the authoritative source, so that whoever's asking just gets a yes, no. And then so we reduce at least the replication of all of this data. So we reduce, hopefully, the amount of breaches we have and the impact of those breaches. And I think that model of how we do data exchanges in terms of verification and getting a claim back, if we can do that across at least the government authoritative sources as we move these into pilot and then into production, that's a good way to help both from a security perspective as well as a privacy perspective.
Yeah, and it's picking up on Phil's point as well as Tim's, as far as the consumer having so much control, right? SSA requires that consent before even that check can happen, knowing that it's just a yes, no, or if SSA has noted the individual has died. But so I like that the consumer consent piece is happening, that control. And Phil's absolutely right. And SSA has built into their user agreement requirements about how the data is stored, the one that's going to SSA, what the financial institutions are doing with that, and then also the result that's coming back. So even around those pieces, we've got standards and requirements that users have to meet.
Thanks. And as we look at more of, how to ensure sort of a consistent national approach, because we might see other federal agencies building these services, states, whether through mobile driver's license app or other, ties into their authoritative data, even cities and counties who issue, birth and death certificates. Tim, I wanted to ask you, one of the things I really like about Congressman Foster's bill, it sort of looks at three pillars. The first is this task force you talked about before, getting government together to think about how to take a whole of government approach. The second part was actually directing the folks at NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, to basically build a framework on the security and privacy and standard side, to set a high bar. And then the third element would be funding grants to the states to essentially implement that framework and accelerate these things. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more, especially I know your boss on the House Science Committee, which has oversight of NIST, what is the role that you guys see for NIST there, and why are they particularly suited to play a role? You may be on mute, Tim. We're not able to hear you right now. I'm sorry. All right. Well, if we're working on getting that sorted, Dustin, I'm not sure if you can help him on the back end. Does somebody else want to take on that question in the meantime? Or talk about things where you guys are already working with NIST and the government on this front?
As a also former NIST alum, I'm going to put on an old NIST hat real quick for you, Jeremy. But, if folks in the audience do not know, NIST essentially has provided digital identity guidance to federal agencies. Now, it's comprehensive enough that many industries outside of government have also adopted it, and many countries really look at it as kind of like that bellwether, very specific, with normative requirements, standard around digital identity that they all kind of strive towards. So I think, Jeremy, if NIST was provided that ability to think about the spec that they have today and broaden it out in terms of a risk framework as well, that is not just for federal use, but for private sector use as well, that could be a really great way to ensure that we've got standardization across the products and at least how we can trust the different products that come out there.
Thanks. And Tim, do we have you back? I saw your microphone's still on mute, but. Yeah, I'm not able to hear you right now. We'll work on that with Dustin.
So speaking from a TSA perspective, we're actually already working very closely with NIST. So NIST actually sits on the working group that's drafting these ISO standards that's going to govern the triangle of trust, as I call it, across this DI space, right? So we're already leveraging the 18013-5, part 5, in order to define the transmissions protocol between the relying party like TSA and the individual with the phone. Having said that, I know they're also sitting on their working group that's working on the standard that's called 23220. That's going to govern the provisioning process between an issuing authority with a trusted identity and to their mobile phone, right? So NIST is already a huge part, and we are relying on them heavily to define this emerging space with their work as we go forward. And with our implementation, our initial pilots, we're hoping to also inform that process. So it's a two-way street, right? So inform the standards development process so as to identify any gaps, articulate any additional needs for that standard to cover. So to make that standard, once it comes out, as it matures, to be as comprehensive as possible.
Great, thanks. Let me shift. Katie, we've talked about ECBSV and, the work for the financial services space. How are you and your coalition thinking about ways ECBSV might be used to support other use cases beyond what's allowed today?
Yeah, Jeremy, it's a great question because it's so great that it's up and running and they've got, nearly 40 million transactions so far. But in the immediate future, I want more financial institutions to be using this. I think now that we've got it up and running, and the good news is SSA is about to open a new enrollment process. So financial institutions or their service providers, and starting in February, that haven't been involved yet will have an opportunity. So I think that's very helpful. And then, we've touched on this a little bit, but I think really exploring how else this ECBSV system can be used. Right now it is limited to financial institutions or their service providers, and it's limited to specific purposes, right? Tied to FCRA. So can we expand the use cases? Can we look at other industries that really would benefit from this, that will have to adhere to the standards that SSA puts forward? And can we get other government agencies plugged in, and start having this cross-agency verification? So those are some of the ways that we're really trying to think about where ECBSV could go. And, again, start also where we can use this model in other agencies.
Thanks. And Tim, do we have you back?
I do, yeah. Sorry, I think I was
Excellent.
jostled my HDMI cord here. Sorry about that.
All right. Well, I'd asked you a question before about NIST. I don't know if you want to go back to that or talk about, broader, models for attribute validation services. But, what were you going to say back when we were trying to hear you?
Yeah, I mean, they covered pretty well. I was just going to reiterate that, them sitting on the OSA standards committee, that's, they know they're the authority here. So allowing them to create these standards for us is what we really need to do.
All right, thanks. And one of the questions we had from comments is, what are your thoughts in terms of prospects for the legislation? It was obviously introduced last year. Congressman Foster held a hearing in the AI task force and the Financial Services Committee. What steps are you all taking in terms of, looking to advance it beyond just the bill sitting on Capitol Hill?
Yeah, absolutely. It's Congress is tough because it's, we move from fire to fire to some extent, especially amongst the pandemic. But we've rephrased this as, it can be a pandemic issue. There's a lot of the rollout of, stimulus support and that sort of thing, the fraud that we saw with that, and a lot of the problems there could have been alleviated with a digital identity framework. So I think that, just making this a priority for a lot of people, you talk to everybody face to face and say, yeah, it's a great idea, but then somehow this gets kind of swept under the rug when it comes down time to actually move this forward. So I think it's just a question of bandwidth, and people are excited about it. Members are excited about it. So we just need to keep on advertising it and pushing it as a priority. And I think we'll get there pretty soon.
Great, thanks. Well, one of the questions I wanted to ask, searching into things that are coming into Q&A, it was a question for Phil Lamb, but I think it's really one for everybody to talk about, which is the EU has proposed the idea that every member state will create what they call an EU digital identity wallet for their citizens. That would essentially be, the backbone of a European digital identity strategy. And I want to actually go beyond Europe to say the UK has a national initiative focused on the UK Trust Framework. In Canada, the work DIAC's been doing up there with their Pan-Canadian Trust Framework. The Australians, somebody from New Zealand pinged me over the weekend that as they're advancing something. It seems like most of the countries that we would look at as our peers in the world are all moving forward with some sort of a strategy, and the US is not. And, wanted to sort of get your perspectives on, that statement, and, do I have that wrong? Or do we need to do something differently?
Well, as it was directed to me, first off, I cannot speak on behalf of all the federal government. But what I will say is, Jeremy, you're not wrong about us potentially being a little behind some of our peers in the identity space. Though I will say, though, that there has been tangible progress. We are making real big step forward. And I think one thing to note, too, is the US government and the US population is sizable, and it is not homogeneous. And also from an agency and a governance perspective as well, we have some very strong agencies with a lot of assets in the space. And we all want to work together towards this. But bringing it all together under one unified strategy, I applaud the work Congressman Foster is putting forward. I think we would need real legislative support to be able to do something like that. It won't be something that we can just kind of do on our own as agencies, but that the desire is there. We've all been here in this space in the US working on this problem, some of us over a decade now. So we're dedicated, but it does take some time.
Any other perspectives?
Yeah, I always thought Phil was speaking for me, actually, but I stand corrected. But having said that, I'm not as pessimistic as Phil. at the risk of being a jingoistic American, I think we are actually doing pretty well, basing our implementation across the whole identity management value chain open standard, so that you don't necessarily need like one issuing authority doing everything on the back end. You actually can have multiple issuing authority, including state governments, but private authorities, as long as you adhere to the set of standards that we can certify through some kind of independent conformance testing as well as interoperability testing for both offline in-person use case like TSA, and in the near future for online use case. I think we have a fairly good basis to move quickly.
Thanks. One question I had too is, when I think about a digital identity wallet, I mean, is that another name for a mobile driver's license app, or is a mobile driver's license app a kind of wallet?
So that depends, right? Is that DI the EU is thinking of? Is that going to be native to an Apple wallet or Google wallet, Samsung wallet? There are advantages to being native to a platform's wallet, right? In terms of security architecture and whatnot. So that's something to be discussed. Having said that, you can definitely have an app-based MDL or digital identity, as long as you adhere to a certain standard that we can also ingest just as equally and just as securely.
Got it. No, thank you. And Phil, if I can throw things, question for you, but I think really when anybody can jump in on, obviously where you sit at GSA and the work with login, there's broader discussion around how can agencies actually more directly support ID proofing in government services. And, this touches a little bit on a question we had on the last panel, as well as something that was getting a lot of attention last week with the IRS, where they rolled out with, a commercial identity provider who is out in front as the one that is getting, their data and validating things. But this is something I pointed out on, a Twitter thread over the weekend. There's things Login might do that also might work with vendors. It might just be a government front end where you're still working with industry partners. And, was raising the, sort of academic question or philosophical discussion of if the front end is different, but, the back end in terms of the types of companies we're using is the same, how much of a difference is there? And so one would just love to get your take on that, but also see if you could talk a little bit more about the vision, I think, for how government agencies as authoritative issuers of identity, can play a role to support ID proofing in government services, perhaps in a way that's different than what they do today.
Sure. So first off, absolutely, the government leverages private sector solutions under the hood of our capabilities today. We do this all day long, not just in identity, broader cybersecurity and others. And I think that's a model that we want to follow and promote. So that partnership between private sector innovation, bringing it into a public center brand or a use case, I think that's something that we value and we would actually want to do more of. Now, that being said, in addition to that, government is authoritative. And when I say authoritative, I mean, we issue actual identifiers. We issue them. That's how we're authoritative on them. So we issue these identifiers today to process and provide you with the benefit that you need, whether it be a social security number, a tax identification number, a known traveler number. We provide that. So we also have to be we government have to be part of that solution too. So bringing together those government sources, bringing in the best of breed in the private sector as well. So we're not recreating something or perhaps rebuilding something that's more costly or inefficient. We want to bring that all together. And I think that's kind of how we see the future of this, is a continued strong partnership between our private sector entities, as well as our public sector partners, whether it be authoritative sources or whether it could be going in person. Because something that another panel brought forward was digital identities, and I think I agree with her, that's an 80% solution. With a 20%, maybe some of the individuals that most need help from a government perspective, they might not have that smartphone. They might not be able to take that selfie. So we got to keep focusing here too, not just on the high tech, but how do we reach those other individuals so we can provide them with equitable access to government resources? And whether it be partnering with in-person capabilities or phone call center capabilities, that's something that we're trying to look at as well.
Thanks. Any other perspectives on what Phil had to say? All right. Well, let me. We're almost at time, and our next panel will be coming on. Let me actually rip off something that Phil just riff off something, not rip off. Sorry, but riff on something Phil just said. That how do we actually make sure this is something that's equitable, that works for everybody? And I think this is a theme we've heard in some of our earlier discussions too. For example, how does it work if you've got an identity verification system for unemployment benefits that assumes possession of a smartphone and somebody doesn't have one? There's a lot of work to be done, really, I think, in terms of meeting the customers where they're at. How do we start to build identity systems that aren't architected in a way where we're going to leave a chunk of the population behind?
Maybe not as so much as a technical feedback, but I know that there was some discussion about using some of the infrastructure money. I know there's a huge push for expansion of broadband and that sort of thing, and that we had a strategy. It didn't end up happening, but to kind of create these digital ambassadors, and they're going to help you sign up for either MDL or better connectivity more generally. So there's definitely room for. There's an educational component for sure. I saw a question in the chat about, making sure that either rural populations or the elderly aren't left behind. And that's certainly something that's not lost on us. And, to the extent that we, implement something that requires the use of a smartphone, then we're going to also have to hand in hand, try to get smartphones into people's hands. But, fortunately, the security components that are required are now, they've been around for a while. They're pretty cheap. I think, an iPhone 4 or 5 usually suffices. So you can get those for usually $100, and the government is certainly, cognizant and trying to help make sure that happens if that's the road that we end up taking.
All right, thanks. Other perspectives from the panel? One last closing thought from everybody before we wrap up. All right. Well, if anybody doesn't have any last points, I appreciate all of you taking the time on this. Great discussion. We'll take a break for about 3 minutes while we exit out and our new panel comes in. And the next face you see after mine will be Eva Velasquez from ITRC, who'll be moderating what should be a great panel on identity and the individual and inclusion that starts to talk even more about these topics. So thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the time.